My name is Marcus Thompson, and I always thought I was just the background nephew until my great Aunt Eleanor left me something that would expose 20 years of family lies. She was the only one who ever saw me as more than an afterthought, the only one who called me by my full name instead of, "Hey you," or "that boy." When she passed away last spring, they gathered around her dining table like vultures, dividing up her legacy while treating me like I was lucky to even be in the room. They said I was just a nephew, nothing more, nothing special. But Great Aunt Ellie had other plans, and the letter she left behind would turn their greed into their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Great Aunt Eleanor wasn't just family to me, she was my refuge. While my parents worked their way up corporate ladders and my brother Kevin collected baseball trophies, I spent my summers at Maple Creek Farm learning things that mattered. Eleanor taught me how to read the sky for weather, how to graft apple trees so they'd bear fruit for decades, how to listen to what people weren't saying. She was 78 with silver hair she wore in a practical bun and hands that could still outwork men half her age. Every morning at 5:30 she'd brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead and we'd walk the orchards together, her pointing out which trees needed attention, which sections of fence required mending, which parts of the land held the most promise. She never married, never had children of her own, but she had opinions about everything and everyone in our family. She'd watch my mother Sarah fuss over appearances and shake her head quietly. She'd see my Uncle Bob make promises he wouldn't keep and click her tongue. But with me, she was different, patient, interested. She'd ask about my job at Riverbend Coffee, about the books I was reading, about my dreams of maybe opening my own place someday. When I graduated college with a degree nobody thought was worth much, she was the only one who showed up to the ceremony. When I struggled to find work that paid enough to live on, she'd slip me grocery money and pretend it was payment for helping with farm chores. Eleanor owned 38 acres of prime Oregon farmland that had been in our family for 3 generations. The apple orchards produced fruit that went to local ciders and organic markets. The farmhouse itself was a 1920s craftsman that she'd maintained perfectly, every board and beam solid as the day it was built. She also had a small collection of vintage cars that she'd inherited from her father, classic Mustangs and Corvettes that drew collectors from 3 states away. But more than the physical assets, she owned shares in Thompson and Sons Hardware, the family business that my great-grandfather had started in 1952. Those shares represented controlling interest, the kind of financial power that could determine the company's direction for the next 50 years. What made Eleanor special wasn't her wealth, it was her clarity. She saw through people's motivations like they were made of glass. She knew that my mother cared more about appearances than substance, that my Uncle Bob would sell his soul for quick profit, that my cousin Jessica measured everything by its social media potential. She watched them visit her exactly twice a year, on her birthday and Christmas, bringing generic gift baskets and staying just long enough to avoid seeming rude. But she also saw that I came around because I genuinely enjoyed her company, that I fixed her fence posts without being asked, that I remembered stories she told and referenced them weeks later. Eleanor had started slowing down the year before she died, moving more carefully, napping in her favorite armchair by the window. But her mind stayed sharp as a blade. She'd make comments about people's true natures that were so accurate, they were almost prophetic. One afternoon while we were pruning apple trees, she said something that stuck with me for months afterward. She looked at me seriously and said, "Marcus, when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time. Don't make excuses, don't hope they'll change. Just remember what you learned and act accordingly." At the time I thought she was talking about a difficult neighbor or maybe giving general life advice. I had no idea she was preparing me for what was coming. The last conversation I had with Eleanor was on a Tuesday in March. I'd stopped by after work to check on a section of fence that had been damaged in a windstorm. She was sitting in her kitchen, papers spread across the old oak table, writing in her careful cursive handwriting. She looked up when I came in, smiled, and asked me to sit down. She poured me coffee from the pot that was always warm and ready, then folded her hands over the papers like she was protecting something precious. She asked me about my plans, about what I wanted to build with my life, about whether I thought I had the strength to handle difficult situations. Her questions felt deeper than usual, more purposeful, but I answered honestly. I told her I wanted to create something meaningful, something that would last, something that honored the values she'd taught me. Eleanor nodded slowly and reached across the table to pat my hand. Her skin was thin and spotted with age, but her grip was still firm. She said, "You're going to face some challenges, Marcus. People you trust might disappoint you, but remember that your worth isn't determined by how others see you or treat you. It's determined by how you handle yourself when times get hard." She paused, looking out the window toward the orchard, then added, "Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you start, they're the ones you finish." I thanked her for the advice, helped her stack the papers neatly, and hugged her goodbye. 3 days later, my mother called to tell me Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was held at Riverside Chapel on a gray Thursday morning. The whole extended family showed up, some relatives I hadn't seen in years emerging from wherever they'd been hiding to pay their respects. My mother Sarah wore black Chanel and sunglasses that cost more than my monthly rent. Uncle Bob arrived in his new BMW, checking his phone every few minutes like he had more important places to be. Cousin Jessica brought her husband and their twin daughters, the girls dressed like they were attending a fashion show instead of a burial service. My brother Kevin flew in from Seattle looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit, making jokes to cover his obvious discomfort with the whole situation. But the strangest part wasn't who showed up, it was how they acted. Instead of sharing memories about Eleanor or talking about what she'd meant to them, they huddled in small groups whispering about practical matters. I caught fragments of conversations about property values and asset liquidation. Jessica kept taking photos of the flower arrangements like she was documenting evidence.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Bob spent most of the service typing on his phone, supposedly handling urgent business matters that couldn't wait until after we buried our great aunt. Even during the graveside ceremony, while the pastor spoke about Eleanor's life and legacy, I could see them exchanging glances and subtle nods like they were confirming some previously discussed plan. I stood apart from their clusters, holding a single white rose that I'd picked from Eleanor's garden that morning. I thought about our walks through the orchard, about her patient teaching, about the way she'd listen to my problems without immediately offering solutions. I remembered her laugh, which was surprisingly loud and infectious for such a small woman. I thought about her fierce independence and her stubborn insistence on doing things the right way even when the wrong way would be easier. While my relatives whispered about money and property, I grieved for the woman who had been my mentor, my friend, and the closest thing to a parental figure I'd ever really trusted. After the service, Uncle Bob announced there would be a reading of Eleanor's will the following Tuesday at the offices of Morrison and Associates downtown. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was scheduling a routine business meeting, rather than discussing the distribution of our beloved aunt's legacy. Jessica immediately pulled out her phone to check her calendar, muttering about having to reschedule a yoga class. My mother asked if she should bring anything special, and Bob assured her it would be straightforward and brief. When I asked if I should attend, there was a pause in their conversation. Bob looked at my mother, who looked at Jessica, who shrugged and said, "I guess he might as well come." Eleanor always had a soft spot for him. The casual dismissiveness in her voice told me everything I needed to know about their expectations. They weren't anticipating any surprises, they'd apparently already decided among themselves how Eleanor's assets would be distributed, and my role would be minimal at best. I was just the nephew, the background family member who showed up to funerals and holiday dinners, but didn't factor into serious financial decisions. They spoke about the will reading like it was a formality, something to be handled quickly and efficiently, so they could move on to more important matters. None of them seemed to consider that Eleanor might have had her own ideas about how her legacy should be preserved and distributed. That night, I drove out to Maple Creek Farm one last time before it would officially belong to someone else. I had a key that Eleanor had given me years ago for emergencies, and I wanted to walk through the house and orchard alone, to say goodbye properly, without my relatives calculating square footage and market values. The farmhouse felt empty but not abandoned, like it was waiting patiently for its next chapter to begin. I sat in Eleanor's favorite chair by the window, looking out at the apple trees we'd pruned together, trying to reconcile the peaceful scene with the mercenary behavior I'd witnessed at the funeral. Part 2. The Loss and False Promise. The weekend between Eleanor's funeral and the will reading felt like holding my breath underwater. I kept replaying moments from the service, trying to understand the undercurrents I'd sensed but couldn't quite identify. Saturday morning, my mother called with what she described as good news. She'd spoken with Uncle Bob and they'd decided the family should present a united front during the will reading. She used phrases like keeping things simple and avoiding unnecessary complications, which made my stomach tighten with unease. Sarah explained that Eleanor had been getting forgetful in her final months, that she'd probably made some impractical decisions that would need to be corrected through family cooperation. She suggested that the farm should obviously go to Bob, since he had business experience, that the hardware store shares should be consolidated under family management, and that Eleanor's car collection would be best sold quickly to avoid storage costs. She spoke about these arrangements like they were foregone conclusions, like Eleanor's actual wishes were just suggestions that could be modified by more practical minds. When I asked how she knew what Eleanor had written in her will, my mother paused before explaining that Bob had spoken with Eleanor's attorney several times over the past year about estate planning matters. She said it was just responsible family management, making sure Eleanor understood the tax implications of her decisions and the practical challenges of maintaining agricultural property. The way she described it made it sound protective and caring, but something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this explanation. My brother Kevin called Sunday evening from Seattle, ostensibly to check on how I was handling Eleanor's death, but really to share his own assumptions about the inheritance. He'd already looked up property values for farms in Newburgh, and calculated what Eleanor's assets might be worth on the current market. He talked about the need to diversify investments and avoid emotional decision-making when it came to family property. Kevin had always been practical to the point of coldness, but his clinical approach to Eleanor's legacy felt particularly jarring so soon after her funeral. Jessica sent a group text Sunday night that included everyone except me, but Kevin screenshot it and forwarded it to me later. She'd written about how grateful they all were that Eleanor had kept things straightforward in her final arrangements, how smart she'd been to structure everything for easy transition, and how important it would be to honor her practical nature by handling the estate efficiently. The message had a celebratory tone that seemed premature and inappropriate, like they were already congratulating themselves on inheriting before they'd actually heard what Eleanor had decided. By Monday evening, I felt like an outsider looking into a conversation that had been happening without me for months. My family seemed remarkably well informed about Eleanor's intentions and remarkably confident about the outcomes, despite the fact that none of them had spent significant time with her during her final year. Their certainty felt unnatural, especially considering that Eleanor had always been unpredictable and independent-minded. She'd never been the type of person to make decisions based on other people's expectations or conventional wisdom. I spent Monday night at my apartment in the Hawthorne district, unable to concentrate on anything productive. I kept thinking about Eleanor's final words to me, about facing challenges and finishing battles I didn't start. At the time I'd assumed she was offering general life advice, but now her comments seemed more specific, more pointed. She'd asked me directly whether I thought I had the strength to handle difficult situations, like she was preparing me for something particular rather than speaking hypothetically. The morning of the will reading, I dressed carefully in my only good suit, a navy blue outfit I'd bought for job interviews 2 years earlier. I caught the bus downtown to Morrison and Associates, a law firm occupying the 15th floor of a glass office building in the financial district. The waiting area had expensive furniture and original artwork, the kind of place that charged premium rates for premium service. My family was already assembled when I arrived, clustered together on leather chairs like they were attending a board meeting rather than a personal family gathering. Uncle Bob wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, checking his Rolex every few minutes and scrolling through emails on his phone. Jessica had dressed like she was attending a cocktail party, complete with designer heels and jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. My mother sat perfectly poised in a black dress that managed to look both morning appropriate and business professional. Kevin looked uncomfortable but determined, like he was bracing himself for an unpleasant but necessary task. The attorney who greeted us was not the elderly gentleman I'd expected based on Eleanor's stories about her longtime legal advisor. Instead, we were met by a young woman named Amanda Chen, who introduced herself as the associate handling Eleanor's estate. She looked nervous, consulting her notes frequently, and avoiding prolonged eye contact with anyone in the room. When I asked about Mr. Morrison, who Eleanor had mentioned as her lawyer for over 20 years, Amanda explained that he'd retired suddenly due to health issues, and the firm was managing his existing cases during the transition. Amanda led us into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. She arranged Eleanor's will and related documents on the polished wooden table, then began reading in a voice that grew steadier as she progressed through the legal language. The will she read was dated 6 months before Eleanor's death, and appeared to have been witnessed by 2 people I didn't recognize. It divided Eleanor's assets among her living relatives in what Amanda described as a practical and equitable manner. According to this document, the farm would go to Uncle Bob as the family member with the most business experience and agricultural knowledge. The hardware store shares would be distributed equally among Bob, Sarah, and Jessica, giving them collective control over the company's future direction. Eleanor's car collection would be sold, and the proceeds divided among all relatives, including me. Her personal effects and household items would go to Sarah as the eldest female relative. The will allocated me a cash payment of $15,000, described as a token of Eleanor's affection for her youngest nephew. The room remained silent as Amanda finished reading. I stared at the papers in front of me, trying to process what I'd just heard. $15,000 was more money than I'd ever had at one time, but it felt completely disconnected from the woman I'd known and loved. Eleanor had never spoken about Bob having agricultural knowledge. In fact, she'd often criticized his lack of understanding about farming and land management. She'd never mentioned wanting her car collection sold, and she'd specifically told me several times how much she enjoyed knowing those vehicles would be preserved and appreciated. More troubling was the complete absence of any personal message or explanation. The Eleanor I knew would never have made such significant decisions without including some kind of written explanation, some way of helping us understand her reasoning. She was a woman who wrote detailed instructions for watering her plants when she went out of town, who left comprehensive notes about apple tree care, who documented family recipes with stories about their origins. The idea that she would distribute her life's work without any personal commentary felt fundamentally wrong. Uncle Bob was the first to speak, thanking Amanda for her professional handling of what he called a difficult situation. He expressed gratitude for Eleanor's wisdom in structuring her estate for smooth transition and minimal family conflict. Jessica nodded enthusiastically, adding comments about honoring Eleanor's practical nature and responsible decision-making. My mother smiled sadly, and murmured something about Eleanor always putting family harmony above personal preferences. Their responses felt coordinated, like they'd discussed appropriate reactions beforehand. None of them seemed surprised by any aspect of the will's contents, and none of them asked questions about Eleanor's reasoning or decision-making process. They accepted the document as final and definitive, ready to move forward with estate settlement immediately. When Amanda asked if anyone had questions or concerns, there was a brief silence before everyone looked at me expectantly. Part 3. The Void and Desperate Search. I sat in that conference room feeling like I'd been erased from my own family history. The will Amanda had read bore no resemblance to conversations I'd had with Eleanor over the years. She'd talked frequently about preserving the farm for future generations, about maintaining family traditions, about ensuring her legacy would honor the values she'd spent her lifetime defending. The document we'd just heard described asset distribution with all the warmth and personal connection of a corporate restructuring plan. Walking out of Morrison and Associates, I felt disoriented and hollow. My family dispersed quickly, Bob mentioning urgent business calls, Jessica rushing to meet friends for lunch, my mother claiming she needed to rest after the emotional stress of the morning. Kevin offered to give me a ride, but his conversation focused entirely on the practical aspects of my inheritance, suggesting investment strategies for my $15,000, and advising me to be grateful for Eleanor's generosity. His well-meaning advice felt like salt in an open wound. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, trying to reconcile what I'd heard with what I'd known. Eleanor had been sharp and decisive until the very end, showing no signs of the confusion or forgetfulness my mother had mentioned. During our final conversation, she'd been writing carefully and purposefully, protecting papers like they contained something precious. The woman who had asked me about my strength and preparation for challenges didn't seem like someone who would leave me a modest cash payment and move on to other concerns. I started making phone calls, beginning with attempts to reach Mr. Morrison, Eleanor's longtime attorney. The receptionist at his former office told me he'd left no forwarding information and had requested privacy during his retirement. When I asked about accessing Eleanor's files or getting copies of previous estate planning documents, I was informed that all records had been transferred to Morrison and Associates and were now confidential client materials. Every avenue I tried led to the same polite but firm dead end. My next step was researching the witnesses listed on Eleanor's will, hoping to understand the circumstances under which it had been signed. The first witness, Patricia Wells, turned out to be a notary public who worked for various law firms around Portland. When I called her office, her assistant explained that she couldn't discuss specific transactions due to confidentiality requirements. The second witness was listed as James Rodriguez, but multiple searches through public directories and professional databases yielded no results. It was as if he'd never existed or had disappeared completely after serving his purpose. I spent hours at the Multnomah County Courthouse, navigating probate records and estate filings, trying to find any documentation that might shed light on Eleanor's actual intentions. The process was Byzantine and confusing, with clerks directing me from office to office in search of records that seemed to exist in theory but were unavailable in practice. When I finally located Eleanor's probate file, it contained only the will I'd already heard, and basic asset inventories. There were no earlier drafts, no notes from attorney consultations, no evidence of the careful consideration Eleanor typically brought to important decisions. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong. Eleanor had been methodical about everything in her life, from farm management to financial planning to family relationships. She kept detailed records of apple harvests, maintained comprehensive files on property maintenance, and documented every significant decision with careful notes and explanations. The idea that she would make the most important decisions of her life without leaving any trail of her reasoning process was completely out of character. I tried reaching out to Eleanor's neighbors and friends, hoping someone might have insights into her final months or knowledge of her estate planning activities. Most of the conversations were brief and unhelpful, people offering condolences and general observations about Eleanor's kindness and independence. But one neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Hoffman who lived on the adjacent property, mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said Eleanor had seemed worried about family pressure in her final weeks, that she'd mentioned feeling rushed to make decisions she wasn't comfortable with. Frank remembered Eleanor expressing concern about relatives who had suddenly become very interested in her affairs, people who had started visiting frequently and asking detailed questions about her assets and intentions. She'd told him about feeling pressured to simplify her estate planning, to make arrangements that would be easier for her family to manage after her death. Frank's recollections painted a picture of a woman under duress, someone being manipulated into decisions that conflicted with her natural instincts and long-term plans. Armed with this information, I attempted to reopen conversations with my family members, hoping to understand their increased involvement in Eleanor's final months. When I asked my mother about her visits to the farm during Eleanor's last year, she became defensive and vague, claiming she'd simply been concerned about Eleanor's health and well-being. Uncle Bob refused to discuss his interactions with Eleanor at all, saying it would be inappropriate to revisit private conversations with someone who had died. Jessica changed the subject entirely, suggesting I focus on positive memories rather than dwelling on details that couldn't be changed. Their evasiveness only strengthened my conviction that the will reading had been a carefully orchestrated performance. The coordination of their responses, their lack of surprise at the will's contents, their immediate readiness to move forward with estate settlement, all pointed to prior knowledge and planning. They had been expecting exactly what they received, which suggested they had been involved in creating exactly what they received. But proving that suspicion would require evidence I didn't possess and resources I couldn't afford. I consulted with 3 different attorneys over the following weeks, hoping to find someone willing to challenge the will or investigate potential irregularities. The conversations were expensive and discouraging, with each lawyer explaining the high burden of proof required to contest estate documents, and the significant costs involved in mounting such challenges. Without concrete evidence of fraud or undue influence, they explained, I would be fighting an uphill battle against well-prepared opponents who had followed proper legal procedures. The most honest attorney I spoke with, an older man named David Chen, who had handled estate disputes for 30 years, laid out the reality of my situation with uncomfortable clarity. He explained that my family had executed what appeared to be a flawless legal strategy, creating documents that would withstand casual scrutiny while serving their own interests. Unless I could prove that Eleanor lacked mental capacity when she signed the will, or demonstrate that she had been coerced or deceived, or produce evidence of an alternative document that reflected her true intentions, I had no viable legal recourse. Part 4. The grinding poverty winter settled over Portland like a blanket of financial reality. My $15,000 inheritance had seemed substantial until I started living on it while working reduced hours at Riverbend Coffee. The money disappeared faster than I'd expected, eaten up by basic survival expenses and the costs of my failed legal consultations. By January, I was rationing groceries and walking to work to save on bus fare, watching my bank balance shrink daily, while my family enjoyed the fruits of Eleanor's lifetime of careful saving and investment. Uncle Bob had wasted no time taking control of the farm, hiring a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations while he explored development opportunities. The apple orchards that Eleanor had tended with such care were neglected, the trees unpruned and the irrigation systems left unmaintained. When I drove past the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the place that had been my refuge, I saw equipment sitting idle and fence posts beginning to lean. Bob was treating the land like a commodity to be exploited rather than a living legacy to be preserved. The hardware store underwent immediate
changes under the new ownership structure. Bob, Sarah, and Jessica implemented cost-cutting measures that eliminated long-term employees and reduced inventory quality in favor of higher profit margins. The store that had been Eleanor's pride, a local institution known for knowledgeable staff and reliable products, became just another generic retail outlet focused on maximum efficiency and minimum customer service.
Eleanor would have been heartbroken to see her father's business transformed into something that prioritized short-term profits over community relationships. Jessica documented her inheritance windfall extensively on social media, posting photos of expensive purchases and luxury experiences funded by Eleanor's estate. She bought a new car, took a vacation to Maui, and renovated her kitchen with top-of-the-line appliances. Her Instagram stories featured champagne dinners and designer shopping trips, each post a casual display of wealth that felt like a personal insult to Eleanor's memory. She seemed to view the inheritance as validation of her importance rather than responsibility for preserving family legacy. My mother used her portion of the estate to upgrade her lifestyle in more subtle but equally significant ways. She joined an exclusive country club, hired a personal trainer, and began shopping at boutiques that charged more for a single outfit than I spent on clothing in a year. She spoke about honoring Eleanor's memory by living well and enjoying life's pleasures, as if conspicuous consumption was somehow a tribute to a woman who had lived modestly and saved carefully. Her justifications felt hollow and self-serving, designed to ease any guilt she might have felt about benefiting from circumstances that seemed increasingly suspicious. Even Kevin, living in Seattle and somewhat removed from the day-to-day dynamics, used his inheritance in ways that would have puzzled Eleanor. He invested in cryptocurrency and high-risk technology stocks, pursuing get-rich-quick schemes that contradicted everything Eleanor had taught about patient, conservative financial management. When I mentioned his investment choices during one of our rare phone conversations, he laughed and said Eleanor would have wanted him to be aggressive and forward-thinking with his money. His interpretation of her values was so distorted it was almost unrecognizable. Meanwhile, I was struggling to afford basic necessities while working longer hours for the same inadequate pay. Riverbend Coffee was a good place to work, owned by a decent man who treated his employees fairly, but it was never intended to provide career-level income. I was skilled at my job, capable of managing complex orders and building relationships with regular customers, but the work offered no advancement opportunities and barely covered my living expenses. Eleanor's small inheritance had given me a brief respite from financial pressure, but it wasn't enough to create real change or security. The contrast between my situation and my family's newfound prosperity was stark and painful. They were living off Eleanor's lifetime of work and sacrifice while I, the person who had genuinely cared for her and spent meaningful time with her, struggled to pay rent on a studio apartment above a restaurant. The injustice was so obvious it felt like a cosmic joke, except the punchline was my empty refrigerator and overdue bills. Every day brought new reminders of what I'd lost and what they'd gained through what increasingly seemed like theft. I found myself avoiding family gatherings and social situations where I might encounter my relatives. Seeing them flaunt their unearned wealth while I scraped together grocery money was emotionally unbearable. When Jessica invited me to her birthday party, hosted at an expensive restaurant and featuring a guest list of people I didn't know, I declined with a polite excuse. The truth was that I couldn't afford the expected gift, couldn't dress appropriately for the venue, and couldn't stomach watching her celebrate with money that should have been used to preserve Eleanor's legacy. The isolation was almost as difficult as the financial pressure. I had lost not only my inheritance but also my connection to the family members who had received it. They seemed uncomfortable around me, perhaps sensing my resentment or feeling guilty about their windfall. Conversations became stilted and superficial, focused on safe topics that avoided mention of Eleanor or estate matters. I felt like a reminder of their questionable behavior, an awkward presence that threatened the narrative they'd constructed about deserving their inheritance. By spring, I was working extra shifts at the coffee shop and taking freelance web design projects in the evenings, trying to build enough financial stability to move forward with my life. The work was exhausting but necessary, and it provided distraction from the anger and grief that threatened to overwhelm me when I had too much time to think. I channeled my frustration into productivity, learning new skills and building a modest portfolio that might eventually lead to better employment opportunities. But despite my efforts to move forward, I couldn't shake the conviction that Eleanor's true intentions had been deliberately obscured. Every time I walked past Morrison and Associates, every time I saw Bob's BMW or Jessica's new designer handbag, every time my mother mentioned her country club activities, I felt the sharp edge of injustice cutting deeper. I knew that $15,000 wasn't Eleanor's idea of adequate recognition for our relationship, just as I knew that dividing her legacy among people who had barely known her wasn't consistent with her values and priorities. The most painful aspect of the whole situation was the way it had corrupted my memories of Eleanor herself. I found it difficult to think about our time together without feeling angry about what had been stolen from me, hard to remember her wisdom and kindness without being overwhelmed by resentment toward the family members who had betrayed her legacy. They had not only taken my inheritance, they had poisoned my ability to grieve properly and remember Eleanor without bitterness. That emotional theft felt even more cruel than the financial one. Part 5. The fake will reading Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that makes Portland feel like it's wrapped in gauze. I dressed in my best attempt at professional attire, a black blazer over khakis that I'd pressed the night before, trying to look like I belonged in a downtown law office even though I felt like an imposter. The bus ride to Morrison and Associates gave me 30 minutes to rehearse questions I wanted to ask, though I suspected my family had already determined what answers I would receive. The law firm occupied an entire floor of the Columbia Center, with panoramic views of the city and Mount Hood visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. The reception area featured expensive leather furniture and original artwork that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Everything about the environment was designed to project success and reliability, the kind of place where important decisions were made by serious people with serious resources. I felt underdressed and out of place from the moment I walked through the door. My family had arrived early and clustered together in the waiting area like they were attending a business meeting rather than the final disposition of our beloved aunt's legacy. Uncle Bob wore a navy suit that looked custom-tailored, complete with gold cufflinks and a silk tie that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Jessica had chosen a conservative black dress that managed to look both respectful and expensive, accessorized with jewelry that caught the light every time she gestured. My mother sat perfectly composed in her familiar funeral outfit, hands folded and expression serene. Kevin looked uncomfortable but determined, checking his phone frequently and adjusting his tie like he was preparing for a job interview. He'd flown in from Seattle specifically for this meeting, which suggested the family considered it significant enough to justify travel expenses and time away from work. Their collective presence felt coordinated and purposeful, like they'd discussed appropriate behavior and responses beforehand. I was clearly the only person in the room who didn't know what to expect. Amanda Chen appeared precisely at the scheduled time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of understated professional attire that suggested competence without calling attention to itself. She looked younger than I'd expected for someone handling such a significant estate, but her manner was confident and businesslike. She greeted each family member by name, which surprised me since I hadn't realized she'd met them before this meeting. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm but her eye contact was brief, like she was already moving on to more important matters. The conference room Amanda led us to was intimidating in its formality, with a polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people and original oil paintings of what looked like Portland's founding fathers hanging on the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the Willamette River and the bridges that connected East and West Portland. The setting felt designed to impress and perhaps intimidate, making clear that we were in a place where serious money and serious legal matters were handled by serious professionals. Amanda arranged several documents on the table with careful precision, organizing papers like she was setting up a formal presentation. The main document appeared to be Eleanor's will, bound in a blue legal folder and marked with official-looking stamps and seals. Supporting materials included asset inventories, property appraisals, and what looked like financial statements detailing Eleanor's holdings. Everything appeared professional and thoroughly prepared, the kind of comprehensive documentation that suggested extensive legal work and attention to detail. Before beginning the formal reading, Amanda delivered what sounded like a prepared statement about the complexities of estate law and the importance of understanding that legal documents represented final and binding decisions. She explained that Eleanor had worked closely with the firm to ensure her intentions were clearly expressed and legally sound, and that the will we were about to hear reflected careful consideration of family dynamics and practical realities. Her words felt rehearsed and slightly defensive, like she was anticipating questions or challenges. The will Amanda read was dated 8 months before Eleanor's death and had been witnessed by two individuals whose names meant nothing to me. Patricia Wells was identified as a licensed notary public, and James Rodriguez was listed as a legal assistant with Morrison and Associates. Amanda read through the technical language efficiently, pausing occasionally to explain legal terminology but maintaining a steady pace that suggested familiarity with the document's contents. Her delivery was professional but somehow lifeless, like she was reading a grocery list rather than distributing a beloved family member's final wishes. According to this will, Eleanor had divided her estate among surviving family members based on what the document described as practical considerations and demonstrated responsibility. Uncle Bob received the farm and agricultural properties, justified by language that referenced his business experience and understanding of land management. Sarah inherited Eleanor's personal effects and household items, described as appropriate for the senior female family member. Jessica received Eleanor's investment portfolio and stock holdings, with text explaining the importance of placing assets with someone young enough to manage them long-term. The hardware store shares were distributed equally among Bob, Sarah, and Jessica, giving them collective control over business decisions and future direction. Eleanor's car collection was designated for immediate sale, with proceeds to be divided among all surviving relatives according to a formula that gave larger shares to what the will called primary beneficiaries. My inheritance was listed last, a cash payment of $15,000 described as recognition of family affection and appreciation for my attention during Eleanor's final years. The language throughout the document was formal and impersonal, lacking any trace of Eleanor's distinctive voice or personal warmth. There were no explanations of her reasoning, no personal messages or expressions of love, no recognition of individual relationships or shared experiences. The will read like it had been drafted by someone who knew Eleanor's assets but not Eleanor herself, someone who understood legal requirements but not personal connections. It felt fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate but sensed deeply. As Amanda finished reading, the room remained silent for several moments. Uncle Bob was the first to respond, thanking Amanda for her professionalism and expressing gratitude for Eleanor's thoughtful planning. He spoke about the responsibility of preserving family assets and honoring Eleanor's practical wisdom in structuring her estate for efficient management. Jessica nodded enthusiastically, adding comments about the importance of respecting Eleanor's final decisions and moving forward in a spirit of family unity. My mother's response was more emotional, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while speaking about Eleanor's generosity and consideration for everyone's needs. She mentioned how difficult it must have been for Eleanor to make such complex decisions, and how grateful they all were for her careful planning and legal preparation. Kevin expressed appreciation for Eleanor's fairness in providing something for everyone while ensuring the major assets would be managed responsibly by family members with appropriate experience. Their responses felt choreographed and artificial, like they were performing gratitude for an audience rather than expressing genuine emotions. None of them seemed surprised by any aspect of the will's contents, and none of them asked questions about Eleanor's decision-making process or reasoning. They accepted the document as definitive and final, ready to proceed immediately with estate settlement and asset transfer. When Amanda asked if anyone had questions or concerns about the will's provisions, everyone looked at me expectantly. I sat there feeling like I'd been transported to an alternate universe where Eleanor had been a different person with different values and different relationships.
The woman described in this will bore no resemblance to the aunt who had spent hours teaching me about apple cultivation, who had listened patiently to my problems and dreams, who had treated me like family when others treated me like an obligation. This Eleanor was a stranger making practical decisions based on business considerations rather than personal connections. But I also recognized that I was alone in my confusion and disappointment. Everyone else in the room seemed satisfied with what they'd heard, ready to accept their inheritance and move forward with their lives. Questioning the will's authenticity or fairness would mean challenging not just a legal document but the entire family's version of reality. I was outnumbered, out-resourced, and apparently the only person who remembered Eleanor differently than the woman described in her supposed final wishes. Part 6. The cold dismissal. I stared at Amanda Chen's professional smile, while my world tilted off its axis. The words she just read felt like fiction, a story about people who shared my family's names but possessed none of their actual history with Eleanor. When she asked for questions, I found my voice despite the tightness in my throat. I asked about earlier versions of the will, whether Eleanor had made any previous estate plans that might explain her reasoning for these particular decisions. Amanda consulted her notes before responding that Eleanor had indeed worked with the firm on multiple drafts over several months, refining her intentions until she arrived at the final version we just heard. She explained that estate planning was typically an iterative process, with clients adjusting their wishes as they considered various factors and received professional guidance. According to Amanda's records, Eleanor had been very specific about wanting to distribute her assets in ways that would minimize family conflict and ensure responsible management of her legacy. Uncle Bob interjected smoothly, mentioning that he'd helped Eleanor understand some of the practical challenges involved in maintaining agricultural property and managing business investments. He spoke about their conversations regarding the importance of placing assets with family members who had relevant experience and resources. His explanation sounded reasonable and caring, but it made my skin crawl because I knew Bob had never shown any genuine interest in farming or land conservation during Eleanor's lifetime. Sarah added her own commentary about Eleanor's concerns regarding my youth and inexperience with significant financial responsibility. She spoke in the gentle, patronizing tone she'd perfected over years of family gatherings, suggesting that Eleanor had been protective of me and worried about the burden that substantial inheritance might place on someone my age. According to Sarah's interpretation, the $15,000 bequest reflected Eleanor's desire to help me without overwhelming me with obligations I wasn't prepared to handle. Jessica nodded enthusiastically while speaking about Eleanor's progressive thinking and her desire to ensure gender equality and asset distribution. She praised Eleanor's decision to entrust significant financial assets to the women in the family, describing it as forward-thinking and empowering. Her analysis was complete nonsense since Eleanor had always been traditionally minded about most things, but Jessica delivered it with such conviction that it almost sounded plausible. Kevin contributed his own perspective about Eleanor's practical nature and her understanding of contemporary investment strategies. He suggested that Eleanor had recognized the need to place her assets with family members who understood modern financial markets and could maximize returns through aggressive portfolio management. His interpretation contradicted everything Eleanor had ever said about conservative investing and long-term stability, but he presented it as if he'd been privy to extensive conversations about her financial philosophy. Their collective reinterpretation of Eleanor's character and values was breathtaking in its audacity. They spoke about a woman who prioritized business efficiency over personal relationships, who valued financial expertise over emotional connections, who made decisions based on practical considerations rather than love and loyalty. This fictional Eleanor bore no resemblance to the person who had spent hours teaching me about soil composition and apple varieties, who had valued tradition and continuity above profit and convenience. Amanda listened to their explanations with professional detachment, occasionally nodding as if their interpretations were consistent with her own understanding of Eleanor's intentions. When I pointed out that Eleanor had never expressed any of these priorities during our conversations, Amanda suggested that clients often share different aspects of their thinking with different family members. She explained that estate planning involved complex considerations that clients might not discuss comprehensively with any single person, even those they were closest to. The suggestion that I might not have known Eleanor as well as I thought felt like a physical blow. These people who had visited her twice a year were claiming deeper insight into her character and motivations than I possessed after spending countless hours in her company. They were rewriting our relationship history in real time, transforming genuine connection into youthful misunderstanding, reducing meaningful conversations to naive misinterpretation. When I asked about the possibility of reviewing Eleanor's medical records to verify her mental capacity during the estate planning process, the room's atmosphere shifted noticeably. Uncle Bob's expression hardened while he explained that questioning Eleanor's competence would be disrespectful to her memory and potentially damaging to the family's reputation. Sarah looked genuinely hurt, suggesting that my suspicions reflected poorly on my trust in Eleanor's judgment and my respect for her autonomy. Amanda intervened professionally, explaining that challenging a will based on mental incapacity required substantial evidence of cognitive impairment and that such challenges were expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful. She mentioned the high legal standards involved and the significant burden of proof required to overturn properly executed estate documents. Her tone was informative but discouraging, clearly intended to dissuade me from pursuing that avenue of investigation. Jessica added that Eleanor had seemed perfectly sharp during her final months, making thoughtful decisions about property maintenance and business matters right up until her death. She described conversations about market conditions and investment strategies that supposedly demonstrated Eleanor's continued intellectual acuity. The problem was that Jessica had barely spoken to Eleanor during those final months, making her testimony questionable at best. My mother delivered the final blow with her characteristic combination of sweetness and steel. She suggested that my emotional attachment to Eleanor might be preventing me from accepting her final wishes objectively. Sarah spoke about the importance of honoring Eleanor's autonomy and respecting her right to distribute her assets as she saw fit, regardless of what others might have expected or preferred. She made my disappointment sound like selfishness and my suspicions sound like disrespect. The meeting concluded with Amanda distributing copies of relevant documents and explaining the timeline for estate settlement. She mentioned that probate proceedings would be straightforward since Eleanor had structured everything properly and there appeared to be no disputes among beneficiaries. The implication was clear that any challenges I might raise would be viewed as disruptive and inappropriate, obstacles to the orderly resolution of family business. As we left the conference room, my family members exchanged satisfied glances and made plans for lunch together. Nobody invited me to join them, which felt like the final confirmation of my new status as outsider and problem. They walked toward the elevators discussing practical matters like asset transfers and tax implications, their voices animated with excitement about their newfound wealth. I stood alone in the hallway, holding copies of documents that described the legal theft of my inheritance. The elevator ride down to street level felt like descending into a different reality, one where justice was whatever powerful people decided it should be, and family loyalty was a one-way obligation that flowed toward those with the most to gain. I walked out of the Columbia Center into the gray Portland afternoon feeling like I'd been hollowed out and refilled with anger and determination. They had stolen my inheritance, but they had also revealed their true characters in ways that would prove useful when the time came for reckoning. Part 7. The haunting doubts. That night I sat in my cramped apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, surrounded by the sounds of late dinner conversations and clinking dishes, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The Eleanor described in that will was a stranger, someone who valued business acumen over personal connection, who prioritized efficiency over sentiment, who would abandon the person closest to her in favor of relatives who had treated her like an obligation. Nothing about it aligned with the woman I'd known and loved. I pulled out a shoebox I'd kept under my bed, filled with cards and letters Eleanor had sent me over the years. Her handwriting was distinctive, angular but elegant, with particular quirks in the way she formed certain letters. I read through birthday cards where she'd written personal messages about my growth and potential, thank you notes for help with farm work that went far beyond polite appreciation, Christmas cards with detailed updates about orchard conditions and apple harvests that she knew would interest me. The voice in these personal communications was warm, thoughtful, and deeply connected to the land and family history. Eleanor wrote about preserving traditions, maintaining the farm for future generations, and ensuring that family values would survive modern pressures toward commercialization and development. She expressed pride in my willingness to work with my hands, my interest in sustainable agriculture, my commitment to values that she felt were disappearing from contemporary culture. In one letter from 2 years earlier, Eleanor had written explicitly about her concerns regarding other family members' attitudes toward the farm and hardware store. She mentioned conversations where Bob had suggested selling agricultural land for development, where Sarah had advocated for modernizing the store's operations to maximize profitability, where Jessica had proposed leveraging family assets for lifestyle improvements. Eleanor had described these suggestions as short-sighted and contrary to everything the family had historically represented. That same letter contained Eleanor's thoughts about legacy and continuity, her belief that preserving family heritage was more important than maximizing financial returns. She wrote about wanting to ensure that future generations would understand the value of hard work, self-reliance, and connection to the land. These weren't the priorities of someone who would distribute assets based on business experience and financial sophistication. They were the values of someone who cared about character and commitment. I spent hours comparing Eleanor's authentic voice in these personal communications with the sterile language of the will Amanda had read. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Eleanor's real writing was full of personality, humor, and genuine affection, while the will was cold, formal, and devoid of any personal touch. Even accounting for the difference between legal documents and personal correspondence, the disconnect was too dramatic to explain through normal variation in writing style or tone. More troubling was the timeline discrepancy I discovered when I organized Eleanor's letters chronologically. The most recent communication I had from her was dated just 6 weeks before her death, and it contained detailed plans for spring orchard maintenance that assumed my continued involvement in farm operations. She wrote about apple varieties she wanted to plant, irrigation improvements that would require my assistance, and long-term soil management strategies that extended years into the future. These plans made no sense if Eleanor had already decided to leave the farm to Uncle Bob and exclude me from significant inheritance. Why would she involve me in detailed agricultural planning if she intended to transfer ownership to someone else? Why would she discuss improvements and investments that would benefit future operations if she was preparing to hand control to someone who had never
shown genuine interest in farming? The disconnect between her planning and her supposed final wishes was too significant to ignore. I decided to drive out to Maple Creek Farm, using the key Eleanor had given me to access the property one more time before it officially transferred to Bob. The farmhouse felt different now, shadowed by knowledge of what was supposed to happen to it. I walked through rooms where Eleanor and I had shared countless conversations, looking for anything that might explain the dramatic change in her intentions during her final months. In Eleanor's study, I found file cabinets full of farm records, business documents, and personal papers that Bob would presumably inherit along with the property. I wasn't looking to steal anything, just hoping to understand Eleanor's mindset during her final period of estate planning. What I discovered was a collection of materials that painted a completely different picture from the one presented in her supposed final will. Eleanor's farm management records extended right up until 2 weeks before her death, with detailed notes about spring planting schedules, equipment maintenance requirements, and long-term sustainability projects. She had been planning actively for future seasons, ordering seeds and supplies, scheduling contractor visits for infrastructure improvements. These weren't the actions of someone preparing to transfer ownership to a relative with no agricultural experience or genuine interest in farming. Her financial records told a similar story of long-term planning and careful stewardship.
Eleanor had been diversifying her investment portfolio gradually, moving money into environmentally responsible funds and sustainable agriculture projects. She had been researching conservation easements that would protect the farm from future development, exploring legal mechanisms that would preserve the land's agricultural character permanently. These financial decisions reflected values that were completely absent from the will Amanda had read. Most significantly, I found a folder labeled Estate Planning Research that contained information about family trusts, agricultural preservation programs, and legal strategies for ensuring long-term land conservation. Eleanor had been investigating complex legal structures that would protect the farm while providing financial security for family members who shared her values and commitment to preservation. These materials suggested sophisticated planning that went far beyond the simple asset distribution described in her supposed final will. Hidden behind other files, I discovered a business card for a different attorney, someone named Margaret Hoffman, who specialized in agricultural estate planning and land conservation. The card was paperclipped to a handwritten note in Eleanor's distinctive writing that said discuss family trust options, conservation easements, succession planning for committed family members. The note was dated 3 months before Eleanor's death, well after the supposed will that had been read at Morrison and Associates. I called Margaret Hoffman's office the next morning, hoping to learn about any consultation Eleanor might have had regarding alternative estate planning strategies. The receptionist confirmed that Eleanor had been a client, but explained that attorney-client privilege prevented discussion of specific consultations or documents. When I identified myself as Eleanor's nephew and explained that I was trying to understand her estate planning decisions, I was told that any information would need to be released through proper legal channels or estate administration procedures. The existence of this other attorney raised fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the will we'd heard. If Eleanor had been working with Margaret Hoffman on sophisticated estate planning strategies focused on land conservation and family succession, why had her final will been prepared by someone else using completely different principles? Why had Amanda Chen made no mention of Eleanor's extensive research into agricultural preservation programs and family trust structures? I began researching Morrison and Associates more thoroughly, looking for information about their expertise and reputation in estate planning matters. What I discovered was concerning and enlightening. The firm was relatively new, established only 3 years earlier, and specialized primarily in business law and commercial transactions. Estate planning appeared to be a secondary area of practice, and they had no particular expertise in agricultural law or land conservation strategies. More troubling was what I learned about Amanda Chen's background and qualifications. Despite her professional demeanor and apparent familiarity with Eleanor's case, Amanda had been licensed to practice law for less than 2 years and had no significant experience with complex estate planning matters. She was essentially a junior associate handling cases that required expertise she didn't possess, which raised questions about the quality and appropriateness of the legal advice Eleanor had supposedly received. The deeper I dug into the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's final will, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The timeline, the legal representation, the content of the document, and the planning materials I'd found at the farm all pointed toward a systematic deception that had diverted Eleanor's true intentions while serving my family's financial interests, but proving that deception would require evidence I didn't have and legal expertise I couldn't afford. Part 8. The grinding investigation. I threw myself into investigating Eleanor's final months with the desperate energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. My shifts at Riverbend Coffee became mechanical routines performed while my mind worked through timelines, connections, and inconsistencies that might reveal the truth about what had happened to Eleanor's real will. I started keeping a notebook filled with questions, dates, and fragments of information that might eventually form a coherent picture of the deception I was convinced had taken place. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Frank Hoffman, Eleanor's neighbor who had mentioned her concerns about family pressure, called me 3 weeks after the will reading.
He'd been cleaning out his garage and found a plastic bag that Eleanor had asked him to store for her during the winter months. Inside were garden tools and a manila envelope that she'd specifically requested he keep safe and dry. Frank apologized for taking so long to remember the storage arrangement and offered to return Eleanor's belongings to me. The envelope contained photocopies of documents that made my heart race with possibility and rage. Eleanor had copied pages from what appeared to be a different will, one that bore no resemblance to the document Amanda Chen had read. This alternative will was dated just 5 weeks before Eleanor's death and reflected the values and priorities I associated with the woman I'd known and loved. It designated specific protections for the farm, established a family trust focused on agricultural preservation, and named me as primary steward of Eleanor's legacy. According to these copied pages, Eleanor had intended to preserve Maple Creek Farm through a conservation easement that would prevent future development while maintaining its agricultural character. The will established a trust structure that would generate income for family members while ensuring that someone committed to farming and land stewardship would make operational decisions. My role was defined not just as inheritor, but as guardian of family values and traditions that Eleanor had spent her lifetime defending. The document also revealed Eleanor's true assessment of other family members' priorities and capabilities. She acknowledged their financial needs while limiting their control over assets they might exploit for short-term gain. Bob was designated to receive cash payments and non-agricultural investments, recognizing his business skills while preventing him from treating the farm as a development opportunity. Sarah and Jessica were provided for through trust distributions that would support their lifestyles without giving them power to compromise the family's agricultural heritage. Most importantly, this alternative will included personal messages that reflected Eleanor's authentic voice and genuine relationships. She wrote about my commitment to learning traditional farming methods, my respect for the land, and my understanding of the long-term thinking required for sustainable agriculture. She expressed confidence in my ability to preserve family values while adapting to contemporary challenges, and she acknowledged the mentorship role she'd played in preparing me for these responsibilities. The copies Frank had stored were incomplete, missing signature pages and legal certifications that would be required to validate the document, but they provided crucial evidence that Eleanor had been developing estate plans completely different from the will that had been read at Morrison & Associates. Armed with this information, I contacted Margaret Hoffman, the agricultural estate planning attorney whose business card I'd found in Eleanor's files. Margaret agreed to meet with me after I explained that I had documentary evidence suggesting irregularities in Eleanor's estate settlement. Her office was located in a converted farmhouse in Hillsborough, surrounded by organic gardens and solar panels that reflected her commitment to sustainable agriculture and environmental responsibility. Unlike the intimidating corporate atmosphere of Morrison & Associates, Margaret's practice felt welcoming and aligned with values Eleanor would have appreciated. Margaret examined the photocopied will pages with professional interest and growing concern. She confirmed that Eleanor had been her client and had worked extensively on sophisticated estate planning strategies designed to preserve agricultural land while providing family security. According to Margaret's records, Eleanor had been very close to finalizing a comprehensive plan that balanced conservation goals with family needs, using legal structures that would protect the farm permanently while generating sustainable income for multiple generations. What Margaret revealed next hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor had scheduled a final appointment to sign her completed estate planning documents just 3 days before her death. Margaret had prepared everything according to Eleanor's detailed instructions, incorporating the conservation easements, trust structures, and succession planning that Eleanor had researched so carefully. But Eleanor had called the morning of their appointment to cancel, saying that family circumstances had changed and she needed to reconsider her options. Margaret had been surprised by Eleanor's sudden change of heart because their months of collaboration had resulted in plans that perfectly reflected Eleanor's stated values and priorities. Eleanor had seemed committed and enthusiastic about the preservation strategies they'd developed, excited about creating a legacy that would honor family traditions while protecting the land for future generations. Her abrupt cancellation had been completely out of character and unexplained. When Margaret had called to follow up several days later, she'd been informed that Eleanor had died and that her estate was being handled by Morrison and Associates. Margaret had assumed that Eleanor had simply chosen different legal representation for her final arrangements, though she'd been puzzled by the departure from their extensive planning work. She had no knowledge of the simple asset distribution will that had been read to my family, and she was shocked to learn that Eleanor's conservation goals had been completely abandoned. Margaret's willingness to testify about Eleanor's true intentions provided the foundation for legal action, but she warned me about the challenges involved in contesting a properly executed will. Even with evidence of Eleanor's alternative planning proving that the Morrison and Associates will was fraudulent, would require demonstrating that Eleanor lacked capacity, was unduly influenced, or that the document itself was forged. The burden of proof was substantial, and the legal costs could be overwhelming for someone in my financial situation. But Margaret also mentioned something that gave me hope. She explained that estate planning attorneys were required to maintain detailed records of client interactions, and that any significant changes in a client's intentions should be documented thoroughly. If Eleanor had legitimately decided to abandon their collaborative planning work in favor of a simpler distribution scheme, there should be clear documentation of her reasoning and decision-making process. The absence of such documentation might itself be evidence of irregularities. I authorized Margaret to begin investigating the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's estate planning during her final weeks. She requested documents from Morrison and Associates, filed motions for access to Eleanor's complete legal files, and began building a case that Eleanor's true intentions had been deliberately obscured. The process was expensive and time-consuming, requiring legal fees that stretched my limited resources to the breaking point. Meanwhile, I continued my own investigation into the key players involved in Eleanor's supposed will. I learned that Patricia Wells, the notary public who had witnessed the document, had a history of working with Morrison and Associates on questionable transactions. James Rodriguez, the second witness, remained untraceable despite extensive searches through public records and professional databases. The more I investigated these individuals, the more convinced I became that Eleanor's will signing had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create legal cover for theft. Uncle Bob's behavior during this period only strengthened my suspicions. Instead of moving forward with farm operations or implementing the improvements Eleanor had planned, he immediately listed the property with a commercial real estate agent who specialized in land development. His actions revealed priorities that contradicted everything Eleanor had valued, and his haste suggested knowledge that challenges to his inheritance might be forthcoming. Jessica's social media activities provided additional evidence of the family's coordinated deception. She posted photos from what she described as a celebration of Eleanor's legacy, featuring expensive dinners and luxury purchases funded by inheritance money. Her captions referenced Eleanor's wisdom in streamlining her estate planning and avoiding unnecessary complications that might have delayed asset distribution. The language echoed phrases I'd heard during our family's discussions, suggesting that their story about Eleanor's intentions had been rehearsed and coordinated. The investigation was consuming my life and depleting my resources, but I couldn't abandon the pursuit of truth about Eleanor's real wishes. Every document I uncovered, every inconsistency I identified, every witness I interviewed added to a growing body of evidence that Eleanor had been manipulated and betrayed during her most vulnerable final weeks. The people who should have protected her had instead exploited her trust to steal the legacy she'd worked her entire life to build and preserve. Part 9, The Truth Bearer, arrives 4 months after that devastating will reading. I was grinding coffee beans during the morning rush at Riverbend when I noticed a man in a well-tailored gray suit sitting at one of our corner tables. He wasn't reading a newspaper or checking his phone like most of our business customers. Instead, he was watching me work with the kind of focused attention that made my skin prickle with unease. When our eyes met, he raised his coffee cup in a subtle salute and continued observing my routine with professional interest. The man remained at his table for nearly 2 hours, nursing a single cup of our house blend, while I served other customers and tried to ignore the weight of his scrutiny. He looked to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet confidence that suggested someone accustomed to being taken seriously. His suit was expensive but understated, his shoes were polished leather that had never seen farm work, and his overall appearance suggested legal or financial expertise. When the morning rush finally subsided, the man approached the counter and introduced himself with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that immediately commanded attention. His name was William Hayes, and he identified himself as a court-appointed estate investigator working on behalf of the Oregon State Bar Association. He explained that his office had received concerns about irregularities in Eleanor Thompson's estate settlement, and that he was conducting a preliminary investigation into the circumstances surrounding her final will. William's credentials were impressive and slightly intimidating. He'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes before transitioning to private practice focused on estate fraud and elder abuse cases. His current role with the state bar involved investigating complaints about attorney misconduct and questionable legal practices, particularly in cases involving vulnerable clients and suspicious circumstances. He spoke with the measured authority of someone who had seen every variation of human greed and deception. What William told me next transformed my understanding of the situation and my prospects for seeking justice. Eleanor's case was not unique, he explained. His office had been tracking a pattern of suspicious estate settlements involving elderly clients, questionable legal representation, and sudden changes in estate planning that benefited family members who had previously shown little interest in the deceased person's welfare. Eleanor's case had triggered multiple red flags that warranted investigation. The investigation had been initiated by Margaret Hoffman, who had filed a formal complaint with the state bar after learning about the dramatic departure from Eleanor's stated intentions and carefully developed estate planning goals. Margaret's complaint had detailed Eleanor's extensive work on conservation planning, her commitment to agricultural preservation, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her sudden abandonment of those plans just days before her death. The Bar Association took such complaints seriously, particularly when they involved potential fraud against elderly clients. William had already conducted preliminary interviews with several key figures in Eleanor's estate settlement, and what he'd discovered was deeply troubling. Amanda Chen's inexperience with complex estate planning had been compounded by inadequate supervision from senior attorneys at Morrison and Associates. The firm had apparently accepted Eleanor as a client, despite lacking expertise in agricultural law and conservation planning, areas that were central to her stated goals and objectives. More concerning was what William had learned about the timeline of Eleanor's relationship with Morrison and Associates. According to the firm's records, Eleanor had first contacted them just 6 weeks before her death, claiming that her previous attorney had become unavailable and that she needed immediate assistance with estate planning matters. She had supposedly demanded expedited service and simplified planning approaches that contradicted the sophisticated strategies she'd been developing with Margaret Hoffman. William's investigation had revealed that Eleanor's contact with Morrison and Associates had been initiated not by Eleanor herself, but by Uncle Bob, who had claimed to be helping his elderly aunt navigate legal complexities during a health crisis. Bob had presented himself as Eleanor's primary caregiver and decision-making support, though medical records showed no evidence of cognitive decline or health emergencies that would have required such intervention. The entire scenario appeared to have been manufactured to justify Eleanor's sudden departure from her established legal relationships. The most damning evidence William had uncovered involved the notary public, who had witnessed Eleanor's will signing. Patricia Wells had a history of working with Morrison and Associates on transactions that the state bar had previously questioned, and her notarization of Eleanor's will contained technical irregularities that suggested either incompetence or deliberate misconduct. The
The second witness, James Rodriguez, remained untraceable despite William's extensive investigation capabilities, which strongly suggested that he was either fictitious or had been compensated to disappear after serving his purpose. William explained that his investigation had reached the point where formal legal action was warranted, but that successful prosecution would require cooperation from Eleanor's legitimate heir, meaning me. He needed someone with standing to challenge the fraudulent will and authorization to pursue criminal charges against the individuals involved in the conspiracy. Without my participation, the investigation would remain administrative rather than criminal, limiting the potential consequences for those who had orchestrated Eleanor's betrayal. The choice William offered was both thrilling and terrifying. I could authorize a full criminal investigation that might result in the fraudulent will being overturned and Eleanor's true intentions being honored, but the process would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally demanding. The people I'd grown up thinking of as family would be exposed as criminals, and the legal battle would likely destroy any remaining relationships while consuming months or years of my life. Alternatively, I could accept the settlement that had already been implemented and move forward with my life, understanding that justice had been denied, but that further pursuit would be costly and uncertain. William made clear that he believed criminal fraud had occurred, but that proving it in court would require substantial evidence, expert testimony, and considerable legal resources. The decision about whether to proceed was ultimately mine to make. I looked around the coffee shop, where I'd been working to survive, while my family enjoyed the fruits of Eleanor's lifetime of labor and sacrifice. I thought about the woman who had taught me about integrity, persistence, and fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. I remembered her final words about facing challenges and finishing battles that others had started, and I understood that this moment was exactly what she'd been preparing me for. Without hesitation, I told William Hayes that I wanted to pursue justice for Eleanor, regardless of the personal cost or family consequences. I authorized him to conduct a full investigation, to pursue criminal charges against anyone involved in the fraud, and to seek complete recovery of Eleanor's stolen assets. If my family had wanted to steal from Eleanor, they would have to face the consequences of their actions. And if they had wanted to eliminate me as a threat to their conspiracy, they had seriously underestimated both my determination and Eleanor's influence on my character. William smiled for the first time during our conversation, an expression that suggested both satisfaction and anticipation. He explained that Eleanor's case was part of a larger pattern of elder fraud that his office was committed to exposing and prosecuting. My decision to seek justice would not only honor Eleanor's memory, but might prevent other elderly individuals from being victimized by similar schemes. The battle ahead would be difficult, but it would be fought with the full resources of the State Bar Association and the criminal justice system. As William prepared to leave, he handed me a business card and a thick folder containing preliminary investigation materials. He explained that formal legal proceedings would begin within days, and that I should prepare myself for what he described as a comprehensive reckoning. The people who had stolen Eleanor's legacy were about to discover that their carefully planned fraud had been built on a foundation that was far less solid than they had believed. Part 10. The Deeper Conspiracy. William Hayes moved with the methodical precision of someone who had dismantled criminal enterprises before. Within 48 hours of our coffee shop meeting, he had assembled a team of forensic accountants, handwriting experts, and digital investigation specialists who began dissecting every aspect of Eleanor's final months. What they uncovered was a conspiracy so elaborate and callous that it redefined my understanding of the people I'd called family for 26 years. The financial trail was the first to reveal its secrets. Eleanor's banking records showed a pattern of unusual activity during her final 8 weeks, transactions that bore no resemblance to her lifetime of careful, conservative financial management. Large sums had been moved between accounts, investment positions had been liquidated without apparent reason, and new financial arrangements had been established that gave other people access to Eleanor's resources. The timing of these changes coincided perfectly with Uncle Bob's increased involvement in Eleanor's affairs. What made these financial maneuvers particularly sinister was their systematic nature. Someone with detailed knowledge of Eleanor's assets and investment strategies had been methodically repositioning her wealth to facilitate the asset distribution described in the fraudulent will. Properties had been appraised by assessors with connections to Bob's business network, investment accounts had been consolidated at institutions where Jessica's husband worked, and legal structures had been simplified in ways that would expedite estate settlement while avoiding scrutiny. The handwriting analysis of Eleanor's supposed signature on the Morrison and Associates will provided even more damning evidence. Expert examination revealed that while the signature was skillfully forged, it contained subtle inconsistencies that indicated deliberate copying rather than natural handwriting. The pressure patterns, pen strokes, and letter formations suggested someone working from exemplars rather than signing naturally. More tellingly, the signature contained characteristics that matched writing samples from Uncle Bob, who had apparently practiced Eleanor's handwriting extensively. Digital forensics revealed an electronic trail that exposed the conspiracy's coordination and planning. Bob's computer contained deleted files showing research into estate fraud techniques, forged document creation, and strategies for manipulating elderly relatives. His browser history included searches for information about challenging wills, statute of limitations for fraud prosecution, and methods for hiding assets from legal scrutiny. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had planned Eleanor's betrayal with criminal sophistication. Jessica's social media accounts, which she had assumed were private, contained conversations with Bob and Sarah that detailed their strategy for isolating Eleanor from her legitimate legal advisors and forcing her to accept simplified estate planning that would serve their interests. These communications revealed their awareness that Eleanor's true intentions conflicted with their financial goals and their determination to
override her wishes through manipulation and deception. They had discussed Eleanor's emotional vulnerabilities, her desire to avoid family conflict, and her tendency to trust relatives who presented themselves as helpful and caring. The conspiracy extended beyond my immediate family to include several professional accomplices who had facilitated the fraud in exchange for financial compensation. Patricia Wells, the notary public, had been paid $5,000 to witness a will signing that had never actually occurred. James Rodriguez, the fictitious second witness, was actually Bob's business associate using a false identity for legal documents. Amanda Chen had been recruited to Morrison and Associates specifically to handle questionable estate matters that more experienced attorneys would have refused to touch. Williams' investigation revealed that Eleanor had been subjected to a sustained campaign of psychological manipulation designed to undermine her confidence in her own judgment and decision-making abilities. Family members had visited her repeatedly during her final months, each presenting different versions of financial advice and estate planning suggestions that created confusion and uncertainty about her options. They had convinced her that her conservation goals were impractical, that her desire to preserve the farm was financially irresponsible, and that her affection for me was clouding her judgment about practical inheritance decisions. The manipulation had been particularly cruel because it exploited Eleanor's deep love for family harmony and her fear of causing conflict after her death. Bob and Sarah had presented their alternative estate planning suggestions as ways to prevent family disputes and ensure that everyone would be treated fairly. They had convinced Eleanor that my youth and inexperience with financial matters made me unsuitable for significant inheritance, and that her desire to preserve agricultural traditions was outdated and potentially harmful to family unity. Medical records provided additional evidence of the conspiracy's impact on Eleanor's final weeks. Her doctor had noted increased anxiety, sleep disturbances, and signs of emotional distress that coincided with the period of intensive family pressure. Eleanor had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by conflicting advice and uncertain about decisions she had previously felt confident about. The medical documentation supported a picture of an elderly woman being systematically confused and manipulated by people she trusted. Most heartbreaking was the discovery of Eleanor's personal journal, which documented her growing distress about family pressure and her uncertainty about how to preserve her values while maintaining family relationships. She had written about feeling torn between her commitment to land conservation and her desire to avoid disappointing relatives who had different priorities. The journal entries revealed a woman struggling with impossible choices created by family members who were pretending to offer help while actually pursuing their own financial interests. Eleanor's final journal entry, written just 3 days before her death, contained a passage that brought tears to my eyes and fury to my heart. She had written about her fear that she was making decisions that would betray everything she had worked to build and preserve, but her exhaustion from family pressure and her desire to trust the people closest to her had overcome her instinctive resistance to their suggestions. She had convinced herself that maybe they were right, that maybe her conservation goals were selfish, that maybe putting financial considerations ahead of personal values was the mature and responsible choice. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond estate fraud to include systematic exploitation of Eleanor's resources during her final months. Bob had used his access to Eleanor's financial accounts to pay personal expenses, Jessica had borrowed money for luxury purchases that were never repaid, and Sarah had charged Eleanor for services and assistance that had never been provided. They had treated Eleanor's wealth as their own while she was still alive, conditioning themselves for the larger theft they were planning after her death. William's team discovered that the conspirators had discussed contingency plans for dealing with potential challenges to their fraudulent inheritance. They had researched my financial limitations, investigated my legal options, and developed strategies for discouraging me from pursuing justice through intimidation and isolation. They had assumed that my grief over Eleanor's death, combined with my limited resources and family pressure, would prevent me from mounting effective resistance to their theft. Their confidence in the security of their conspiracy had made them careless about covering their tracks, leaving behind evidence that would have been destroyed by more sophisticated criminals. Phone records, email communications, financial transactions, and personal documents created a comprehensive record of their planning, execution, and post-fraud celebration that would be impossible to explain away or deny. They had documented their own criminal behavior with the thoroughness of people who never expected to face investigation or prosecution. The psychological evaluation that William arranged as part of his investigation confirmed that Eleanor had retained full mental capacity throughout the period when the fraudulent estate planning had occurred. Her cognitive abilities, memory function, and decision-making skills had all been within normal ranges for someone her age, eliminating any possible defense based on diminished capacity or incompetence. The fraud had been perpetrated against a mentally competent elderly woman who had been deliberately deceived and manipulated by family members she trusted. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, William filed formal criminal charges against Bob, Sarah, Jessica, and their professional accomplices. The charges included elder fraud, conspiracy, forgery, theft, and abuse of a vulnerable adult, carrying potential sentences that could result in years of imprisonment and complete financial restitution. The scope and sophistication of the conspiracy elevated it from simple inheritance disputes to serious criminal activity that would be prosecuted with the full resources of the State Attorney General's office. Part 11: The Legal Hammer Falls. The morning that criminal charges were filed against my family dawned gray and drizzling, typical Portland weather that seemed appropriate for the reckoning that was about to unfold. William Hayes had coordinated the arrests with law enforcement agencies across 3 counties, ensuring that all the conspirators would be taken into custody simultaneously to prevent evidence destruction or witness intimidation. I was not present for the arrests, but William called me as they were happening to confirm that justice was finally moving forward. Uncle Bob was arrested at his downtown office while meeting with potential investors about developing Eleanor's farm property. The irony was not lost on me that he was planning to profit from stolen land while being handcuffed for the theft that had made those plans possible.
Witnesses described his shock and indignation as federal agents seized his computers, phones, and business records, treating him like the criminal he had always been but never expected to be recognized as. Sarah was taken into custody at her country club during what she had described on social media as a celebration brunch with friends who were admiring her recent lifestyle improvements. The public nature of her arrest added humiliation to the legal consequences, exposing her criminal behavior to the social circle she had been so eager to impress with Eleanor's stolen wealth. Her friends learned simultaneously that her recent prosperity was built on elder fraud and that their admiration had been supporting criminal activity. Jessica's arrest occurred at her home while she was hosting a playdate for her twin daughters, creating a traumatic scene that would have lasting consequences for the children who worshiped their mother. The contrast between the domestic normalcy of children's laughter and the criminal reality of handcuffs and Miranda rights was stark and sobering. Jessica's husband, who had been kept in the dark about the conspiracy, learned about his wife's criminal activities as neighbors watched from their windows. Kevin's arrest in Seattle was handled by federal marshals who coordinated with Oregon authorities to ensure that geography would not provide escape from justice. His shock was apparently genuine, as he had been a passive beneficiary of the conspiracy rather than an active participant. However, his acceptance of inheritance that he had reason to believe was fraudulently obtained made him liable for criminal charges and civil restitution regardless of his level of direct involvement. The professional accomplices who had facilitated the fraud were arrested simultaneously, preventing them from coordinating their responses or destroying evidence. Patricia Wells was taken into custody at her notary office, where investigators seized records documenting her pattern of participating in questionable legal transactions. Amanda Chen was arrested at Morrison & Associates, where she was attempting to destroy files related to Eleanor's case when federal agents arrived with search warrants. The news of the arrest spread quickly through Portland's legal and business communities, generating headlines that described the conspiracy as one of the most elaborate elder fraud schemes prosecuted in Oregon history. The media coverage was extensive and unflattering, detailing the sophisticated planning involved in betraying an elderly woman's trust and stealing her life's work. My family members went from being respectable community members to notorious criminals overnight. The immediate aftermath of the arrests was chaotic and revealing. Bob's business associates and clients began distancing themselves from him as the fraud charges became public, concerned about their own reputations and potential legal exposure. Several real estate deals that had been based on anticipated income from Eleanor's estate were canceled, leaving Bob facing financial obligations he could no longer meet. His transformation from successful businessman to criminal defendant was swift and comprehensive. Sarah's social circle abandoned her with the same enthusiasm they had shown for embracing her when she had seemed wealthy and successful. The country club where she had been celebrating her recent prosperity revoked her membership pending resolution of the criminal charges. Her church, where she had been a prominent donor using Eleanor's stolen money, requested that she discontinue her involvement in leadership roles until her legal situation was resolved. Jessica's life unraveled with particular drama as her husband filed for divorce and sought custody of their children, citing her criminal behavior as evidence of unfitness for parenting. Her social media accounts, which had documented her enjoyment of stolen wealth, became evidence in custody proceedings and criminal prosecution. The lifestyle she had built on Eleanor's money disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by legal bills and social isolation. The financial consequences of the arrests were immediate and severe. All assets that had been distributed through Eleanor's fraudulent will were frozen pending criminal prosecution and civil restitution proceedings. Bank accounts were seized, property transfers were reversed, and investment accounts were placed under court supervision. The conspirators discovered that their criminal activity had not only failed to provide permanent wealth but had actually made them financially vulnerable to complete asset forfeiture. Margaret Hoffman, Eleanor's legitimate estate planning attorney, was appointed by the court to serve as temporary administrator of Eleanor's assets while the criminal case proceeded. Her first action was to implement the conservation easements and trust structures that Eleanor had originally planned, ensuring that the farm would be protected from development regardless of the ultimate resolution of the criminal proceedings. Eleanor's true intentions were finally being honored even as justice for their betrayal moved forward. The psychological impact of the arrests was as significant as the legal consequences. My family members had built their lives around the assumption that their fraud would never be discovered or prosecuted, that their social status and apparent respectability would protect them from consequences. The reality of criminal prosecution shattered their self-image and forced them to confront the gap between their public personas and their actual criminal behavior. Phone records seized during the arrests revealed frantic communications between family members in the hours after they learned about the investigation. They had discussed fleeing the jurisdiction, destroying evidence, and blaming each other for the conspiracy's exposure. Their panic and mutual recriminations provided additional evidence of their guilt while demonstrating the fragility of criminal partnerships built on greed rather than genuine loyalty. The most satisfying aspect of the arrests was the speed with which the conspiracy unraveled once it faced professional investigation. What the conspirators had assumed was a perfect crime was actually an amateur operation that left behind extensive evidence of their criminal planning and execution. Their confidence in their own cleverness had made them careless about covering their tracks, creating a comprehensive record of their betrayal of Eleanor's trust. William Hayes briefed me regularly on the progress of the criminal case, explaining that the evidence was so overwhelming that plea bargaining would likely be the defendant's only realistic option for avoiding maximum sentences. The conspiracy charges alone carried potential sentences of 15 to 20 years, while the elder fraud and theft charges could add additional decades to their prison terms. The prosecutors were confident that justice would be served comprehensively and publicly. The media attention surrounding the case brought unexpected support from other families who had experienced similar fraud schemes targeting elderly relatives. I received calls and letters from people who had been victimized by comparable conspiracies but had lacked the evidence or resources to pursue justice. Eleanor's case was becoming a symbol of resistance to elder abuse and a demonstration that criminals could be held accountable regardless of their family relationships or social standing. Part 12: The Smoking Gun Evidence. While the criminal charges were proceeding through the court system, William Hayes's investigation team made a discovery that transformed our case from strong to absolutely devastating. Hidden in Uncle Bob's home office behind a false panel that investigators almost missed, they found Eleanor's real will along with documents that revealed the full scope and timeline of the conspiracy against her. This evidence was so damning that it would eliminate any possibility of plea bargaining and ensure that maximum sentences would be imposed on all participants. Eleanor's authentic will was everything I had hoped it would be and everything the conspirators had feared it was. Dated just 2 weeks before her death, it reflected all the careful planning she had done with Margaret Hoffman regarding conservation easements, family trusts, and agricultural preservation. The document was properly witnessed, legally executed, and filled with Eleanor's distinctive voice expressing her values and intentions. Most importantly, it explicitly revoked any previous wills and included specific language designed to prevent the kind of fraud that had ultimately been attempted. The real will designated me as primary beneficiary and conservation steward of Maple Creek Farm, with legal obligations to maintain its agricultural character and environmental integrity. Eleanor had structured the inheritance to provide financial security while ensuring that the land would never be developed or exploited for short-term profit. She had created trust funds for other family members that would support their needs without giving them control over assets they might misuse. But Eleanor had gone beyond simply distributing her assets according to her values. The real will included a detailed letter explaining her reasoning and documenting her awareness of family members' true priorities and character. She wrote about Bob's willingness to sacrifice family traditions for financial gain, Sarah's materialism and lack of genuine care for others, and Jessica's selfishness and irresponsibility. Eleanor had seen through their manipulations and planned accordingly. More devastating was Eleanor's documentation of the pressure campaign that had been mounted against her during her final months. She had kept detailed records of conversations where family members had tried to convince her to abandon her conservation goals, simplified her estate planning, and exclude me from significant inheritance. Eleanor had recognized their manipulation for what it was and had deliberately created evidence that would expose their intentions if anything happened to her authentic estate planning documents. The most shocking discovery was a series of audio recordings that Eleanor had made secretly during her final weeks, capturing conversations where family members revealed their true intentions and discussed strategies for overriding her wishes. These recordings provided indisputable evidence of the conspiracy's scope and the deliberate nature of their fraud. Eleanor had anticipated their betrayal and had prepared evidence that would ensure their prosecution if they followed through with their plans. In one particularly damning recording, Bob and Sarah could be heard discussing the need to prevent me from inheriting significant assets because I might interfere with their plans to develop the farm property. They talked about my attachment to Eleanor's conservation goals as an obstacle to maximizing the estate's financial value, and they strategized about ways to minimize my inheritance while maintaining appearances of family fairness. Their conversation revealed not only greed but active hostility toward Eleanor's values and my relationship with her. Another recording captured Jessica explaining to her husband how they could use Eleanor's money to fund lifestyle improvements while making it appear that Eleanor had chosen to support their financial needs. Jessica discussed Eleanor's emotional vulnerabilities and suggested ways to manipulate her guilt about family harmony to secure favorable treatment in estate planning. The recording revealed Jessica's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and her willingness to exploit an elderly relative's trust. The most heartbreaking recording was Eleanor's private message to me, recorded just days before her death when she apparently sensed that her time was limited. She spoke about her love for me, her pride in the man I had become, and her confidence that I would preserve the values and traditions she had spent her lifetime building. Eleanor acknowledged that other family members might challenge her estate planning decisions, and she expressed her determination to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail over greed and deception. Eleanor's recorded message also revealed her awareness that the pressure campaign against her was intensifying and that she might be forced to make public concessions to maintain family peace while secretly preserving her true intentions through legal mechanisms that would survive her death. She had been playing a sophisticated game, appearing to yield to family pressure while actually creating evidence that would expose their manipulation and ensure that justice would be served. The audio recordings were supported by Eleanor's written journal entries, which provided context and timeline for the conversations that had been captured electronically. Her journal revealed the emotional toll that the family pressure campaign had taken on her, but also her determination to protect her legacy from people who would exploit it for purposes that contradicted everything she had worked to achieve. Eleanor had been fighting a war against her own family members, and she had been winning even as they thought they were succeeding. Technical analysis of the recordings confirmed their authenticity and established a precise timeline for the conspiracy's development and execution. The conversations had taken place over a period of 6 weeks, documenting a systematic campaign to isolate Eleanor from her legitimate legal advisors, confuse her about her options, and pressure her into abandoning her conservation goals in favor of simplified asset distribution that would serve the conspirators' financial interests. The existence of Eleanor's real will and supporting documentation completely undermined the legal foundation of the fraudulent estate settlement. The Morrison and Associates will was revealed not just as forgery but as part of a comprehensive conspiracy to steal Eleanor's legacy while she was still alive to witness their betrayal. The evidence showed that the conspirators had known about Eleanor's true intentions and had deliberately worked to subvert them through criminal activity. William Hayes explained that the discovery of Eleanor's authentic estate planning documents would result in additional criminal charges being filed against all participants in the conspiracy. The evidence of premeditation and sophisticated planning would elevate the charges to felony levels that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The conspirators would face decades in prison rather than the shorter sentences that might have been possible through plea bargaining. The audio recordings would be particularly devastating in court because they captured the conspirators' own words describing their criminal intentions and methods. No amount of legal representation would be able to explain away their recorded discussions of fraud, manipulation, and theft. Their own voices would convict them more effectively than any prosecutor's arguments or witness testimony. Margaret Hoffman confirmed that Eleanor's authentic will was legally superior to any document that had been created subsequently and that the conservation easements and trust structures described in the real will would be implemented immediately. Eleanor's true wishes would finally be honored and the farm would be preserved according to her values rather than exploited according to her family's greed. The emotional impact of discovering Eleanor's real will and hearing her recorded messages was overwhelming. After months of feeling like I had lost not only my inheritance but also my connection to Eleanor's memory, I finally had proof that she had loved me as much as I had believed and that she had anticipated the challenges I would face. Eleanor had not abandoned me, she had armed me with the tools necessary to seek justice for her betrayal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.